This time on Poll Hub, we have talked a lot about how partisan America has become over the last 20 years or so, at least in part because it manifests in so many very obvious political ways. But is it more than just the politicians you support? The answer is, spoiler alert, yes. And we're diving into how almost everything in American life today can be seen through a partisan lens. Then, working moms were a rarity in America until fairly recently. Now, almost the same percentage of women work as men. But what's the impact on families? How's the burden of work and life shared or not? We're going to talk about that. And we finish with a fun fact perfectly fit for the season. And I, for one, am very surprised by the top answer. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho. I'm Mary Griffith.
And I'm Lee Murray.
So as we mentioned in the open, partisanship is something that we talk about almost every week on the show, and have. We've done 405 episodes, right? We've been doing this since 2017. Partisanship is something we talk about in almost every episode because it does just infuse America nowadays. Now, we mainly think about that in political terms, but one of our student producers is like, it's not just that. It's beyond just, are you red, are you blue, are you voting for this person or that person? And did some research and found a lot of really fascinating stuff about how we divide ourselves, maybe not consciously, but there is a partisan divide on almost everything, including what you eat and what you watch and much more interesting things than that. So let's go into a few of these and talk about these. So for instance, in June 2025, just a couple months ago, Axios had a piece about artificial food dyes. So are artificial food dyes something that should be in food or not? 47% of Republicans said get rid of all the food dyes, even if food costs more. Only 26% of Democrats said that. That might not be what you expected, right? So let's say you're in the line at the grocery store. The mom in front of you grabs the organic fruit snacks, no dyes. She's health conscious. Or is she making a political choice? That's a question. But wait, there's one more thing that we can agree on. And this is nonpartisan, but when we're talking about food, according to that Axios article, 87% of Americans agree that the government should do more to ensure food safety, like reducing pesticides and improving labeling. So we talk about partisanship. There's something as easy as, do you have a food dye in a food or not, or as non-political. But then at the same time, Americans do agree on the fact that there should be safety for this. Let's do one more. Coffee. You go out for coffee. According to a 2024 article in Newsweek, of the top 10 most coffee-loving states, 9 are blue states. Meanwhile, the states least interested in coffee tend to be obviously Republican-leaning states. There is a red-blue divide when it comes to coffee. Lee, you have studied political science for decades. You have seen this partisan divide grow in politics. What's your take on it growing in culture or in society?
I think it's really fascinating. I was wondering if they broke that coffee down to decaf or high test coffee or latte or something. I think there's much more behind that we could dig down and find out whether there's strong partisans, depending on how strong they like their coffee. Anyway, I will digress less on this and move back to the topic. Yeah, I think there are communities where if you have different kinds of stores, those are seen as being more Democratic areas or more Republican areas. And I think there's all kinds of looking at behavior and patterns and attitudes that influence this. And I think it's interesting. And, if I had my AI hooked up right now, I'd be asking it some of these very same questions because I think it would be able to weigh in on it. I think also, I know I look at endorsements by non-political people. So things like, athletes, well, what do they know necessarily more about politics? But I like an athlete more if they endorse the candidate I support, or actors or musicians. And I think there's become a cultural dividing line there when you are looking for red and blue indicators from people who do sports, act, or play an instrument. I don't know, just to your point on how much it pervades our culture.
But Barb, obviously, it's beyond just like campaigns and elections. In 2024, Columbia Business School did a study, and they found that Democrats and Republicans are different on brands. For instance, Burt's Bees, which you may put on your lips, but you only do that if you're a Democrat. 72% blue for Burt's Bees as a product they like. Cabela, 84% red. Cabela's the store. So it's into the products and the things we watch that are partisan differences. Is that just cultural? Or one of the things we talked about in prior episodes is how we sort ourselves. We're increasingly sorting ourselves in ways that end up looking partisan. Do you think that's what's going on?
think there's a difference in here between correlation and causation. And so, yes, I think that there is certainly a correlation between, perhaps political ideology and behavior. And part of that is due to how our politics has evolved, which we've talked about here in terms of the fact that you now root for a particular team and we tend to identify with one side or another. We also are very siloed in terms of the messaging and the sources of information. So as those get divided up, if you think about how companies need to market their different products, they are actually having to make those judgments in an ideological fashion as well. And then the other thing that really comes to my mind is Citizens United. And Lee, you talked about athletes and you talked about musicians. And I don't think that celebrity endorsements is anything new. But I think what is new is for corporate America to be so blatant about their choices over the last decade, since corporations were deemed people by the Supreme Court and therefore able to use finances and their economic weight to put behind candidates whose policies they preferred. So I think we see a whole combination of factors here of how the culture has adapted to a lot of the different changes, not only in our politics, but in how we communicate with each other and how we get the information that we do get. And I don't think it's just about politics, but certainly we can divide things up very neatly in many cases.
I was just going to say, and social media really lets us know that a product is given money to X, Y, and Z. And maybe if you don't like that, you shouldn't purchase or line up favor. Yeah. So like you said, communication has changed as well. And that really fuels all this.
So there's another one, Lee, that might be interesting to you. We did a poll in April of this year, and we were asking, do you think the Yankees are going to have a good season? 69% of Republicans said, yeah, Yankees, they're going to have a better season. 61% of Democrats. Not a big gap, but the Yankees are blue. You'd think that they would do better with blue people, wouldn't you?
Well, funny you should bring that up. I haven't looked at the standings lately, but I think maybe not all polls are predictive. How's that?
Oh, there you go. So one more, and this is about a very popular musical artist. So Taylor Swift, we asked in December of 2023, and you recall that Taylor Swift at the time was in the news, not only because she was making $1 trillion on her tour, but she was a date at the time, an NFL player who was in the Super Bowl, and she went to the Super Bowl, and we asked questions. There's all this interest about, is the Super Bowl interesting because of Taylor Swift, or is it interesting because of the game and why are people watching and all that? Anyway, so we asked, is Taylor Swift good for the NFL or not? And 86% of Democrats said, yeah, she's good for the NFL. 57% of Republicans said that. So that's a partisan divide too. But again, is that a cultural divide when you plug it in with the NFL and football and all of the partisan of the NFL that's happened? It just seems very mixed.
The celebrity thing, I think we've sort of always had. Once we had mass media, we had celebrities and, what they, eat and drink and say and do was always, fodder for the rest of us. But I do think that there is a danger here because we're often making choices based on the values and perhaps the emotions that we have towards something rather than the science of something. I think we have a science which says that there are pluses to organic foods and having foods that are grown with fewer pesticides. I think there is science that talks about some of the dangers and concerns of food dyes and additives to food. But what happens is it was so counterintuitive,
right?
The question on the artificial food dyes to see that only 26% of Democrats think that removing them, is a good thing. No, that used to be a Democratic issue, but now it isn't because
RFK.
Yes, RFK and the Health and Human Services. So how are these things being translated? And it would be really nice if we could get back to a place where we were discussing fact as opposed to opinion and emotion.
From politics to parenting, today we're talking about the duality that many moms and dads face working and caring for their families. Gender bias and stereotypical gender roles are not new. In fact, we've talked about them many times right here on the podcast. However, attitudes about households having two parents working have changed. So what's going on and what's the impact on the kids and families? So of course, this is a topic that interests me, and let's dive in with some numbers right up top. So almost 90 years ago, Gallup first began tracking questions on women's right to work. And one of the questions that they asked was, do you approve of a married woman earning money in business or industry if she has a husband capable of supporting her? The answer, as Jay laughs, is 18% approved and 72% said they disapproved with a resounding no. Now, fast forward a couple of decades to 1969, and that number jumped to 55% who said that, yes, women should be allowed to work outside of the home. 40% disapproved of women working. Of course, as pollsters, we don't really ask that question anymore. We now know how many women are in the workforce today. And that number has steadily increased since the late 1980s to around 60%. It's also worth noting that the percentage of men in the workforce has steadily declined since 1948 and currently stands at about 68%. So with so many households having two parents out in the workforce, what's the impact? So let's go straight to the source and let's talk about what some of the kids think. Pew Research Center surveyed teens ages 13 to 17 in 2024 and found that 43% of teenagers said kids are better off when one parent does not have a job and focuses on the family. However, 57% said there's no difference. Now turn that around to see what parents think. And again, according to Pew, a majority of adults, 55%, said that kids with two parents are better off when one parent doesn't work. Like I said, almost a perfect flip of what teens said. 43% said kids are fine with both parents working. So let's open this up. I have very strong feelings about this, but Jay, what do you think about this? Did the percentage flip surprise you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that parents and kids have a different view of this. I do love, that we start with questions from the 1930s, because one of the things we love to do on this podcast is look at public opinion data and talk about how it's changed over the years. And this is just one of the starkest differences. Public opinion polling didn't really start until about the time this question was asked in the mid-1930s. And so we have kind of a perfect representation of this huge societal flip as it's reflected in public opinion, and then it's how it's reflected in empirical data. So I think it's really a fascinating thing to look at how much of this shift has happened. Of course, we've seen it, we've all lived it, but then to flip it and ask the kids and the parents and to see this almost mirror image of how they think it's going or what they think the impact of having two parents working, I think is really interesting. I'm a little surprised that 57% said there was no difference. They didn't say it was better or worse. They said it was no difference. And I think that's the most interesting thing in that number to me is 43% say they're better off if one of the parents stays at home. 57% said there's no difference. It's not like kids are saying, yeah, I want both parents at work. That number is actually really, really small. Whereas parents, 43% say it's fine if both parents are working. So I think there's some nuance in that data. And it maybe says actually that the kids are not as okay about it as the first blush might look in that data. I don't know.
I want to bring Barb into this, but I want to bring up a statistic that I thought was really interesting from the Pew Research Survey. And this is about who teens felt should be making the money in the household. And 42% said that fathers should be mostly responsible for paying the bills, while only 2% say mothers should. The majority, 56%, say that both moms and dads should be responsible for making money to pay the bill. I'm just going to jump in here and say, when Jay, you bring up the nuance, the question of whether or not should be paying the bill is an interesting distinction here, because I think a lot of that depends on what the family circumstance is. Now, we all know I have 3 children from a dual working household, but my kids' perception is that dad pays the bills. And I think that we have lots of conversations about that, but dad actually says, no, mom and dad pay the bills. It depends in our household as to who actually sits down to pay the bills. And so it comes back to the chore and perhaps some gender role stereotypes in our household. Barb, what do you make of all of this?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. If I harken back, though, to the early data that Jay was pointing to, we couldn't even conceive of structuring a question in this manner. One of my favorites is Roper in 1939 asked Americans, under what circumstances would it be okay for a woman to work? It really speaks to the cultural shift, how we speak to each other, the questions that seemed relevant at that time. That said, I think it's really interesting that still those values, those gender stereotypes are still alive and well. I mean, we still do see a division of what women should be doing in the home and what men should be doing in the home. But when you point to the kids' data, I think what's fascinating is that they don't necessarily see those gender stereotypes as much as earlier generations do. And so one of the differences that I find fascinating between the parents and kids is the fact that we do still have those strong stereotypes that are pervasive, but the kids are much more likely to say, yeah, if I'm homesick, yeah, mom and dad should both be concerned about me.
There's one piece of data that I found really interesting, and this came from Harris, and it was about whether or not children should become more independent or more self-reliable with more parents working outside of the household. I thought that this was really interesting because, probably not surprisingly, parents these days who do work think that, yeah, my kids should have a little bit more responsibility and should take care of themselves a little bit more. But it's a shift from the 1980s. And I wonder if the generational changes have had an impact on a perception, because when you think about it, moms and dads today are the children of those parents of the 1980s who were the first to have moms outside of the household who were in the workplace. And perhaps now they're like, well, you know what? Maybe my kids should be taking a little bit more care of themselves than perhaps I did way back then.
So I'm looking at all this and I'm trying to figure out a couple of positions that I might have, given that I don't have any kids. And so I don't have this dilemma. But I'm wondering, is it a cart or a horse? So did the values change about women working, or was there a show me the money need here where there was not enough money coming in and therefore women had to join the workforce in order to maintain a standard of living? Because in the 1950s, I think it was a different ballgame in terms of what one income earner in a household could do for the family. And now that by necessity, it almost seems too that you need to, and maybe even more. And so I'm sort of thinking, did the values change or did the economic necessities shift? And then we sort of said, yeah, this is a good thing. The other thing I want to just throw out there is, and I don't have the answer to this, but is it pejorative now to have referred to back then latchkey kids because the parents were out and both were working? It almost seems, I don't know if the phrase has a negative connotation or not.
It's kind of gone. I hadn't thought about that phrase for years. That was something that social scientists talked about and social theorists worried about or didn't worry about. But yeah, it's interesting. That's a phrase that's gone.
One of the things I see too that's missing, it would be very interesting because I'm not sure that quantitatively you can measure this as well as perhaps qualitatively. But the perceptions of these teens, the 13 to 17-year-olds, I would find it actually jarring to even question the fact that women shouldn't be or have the opportunity to work. And I don't want to call it a choice because I think, Lee, your point is incredibly well taken. I think that there are a lot of people, men and women, that probably would choose not to have the job they have or not to have as many jobs as they do have if they didn't have the economic necessity to do so. But I was actually kind of interested in, were these questions something that these teenagers actually think about at this point, or has it become so commonplace that it's almost a false choice? And I come to that because for many of the questions, they just said both parents when we were talking about gender roles, because there was more extensive questions that were in this study. And it almost seemed like we as researchers might be trying to make a distinction where this generation doesn't really make that distinction.
Turning now to a fun fact, as we do at this portion of every podcast. And this one's something everybody can weigh in on. And right now, with it being so humid and hot out, I think it might have influenced what the data was. This was done in 2016, but in July. So put that in the back of your mind. National audience asked by CBS News, what is your favorite summer month? June, July, August, or September? I don't know if September is really a summer month, but we're going to see in the fact that 32%, the plurality, said September, 26% for July, 25% for June, and 15% about baking during August, not so favorable. So I'm a June person. I like it. It's calm. It's the beginning of the summer. And I do not like August for the reason I indicated. It's hot. And if you're anywhere where it's really hot, you know how hot it is.
Your question about June, Lee, you did mention in our previous segment how you didn't have kids. Well, for half of June to almost in some places 3/4 of June, kids are still in school. So maybe that's the reason for bringing in September. I'm not sure. I don't think of September as a summer month either. I love the month of September. So I can see why it may have topped the list given the choice. But if I think of the 3 months that are the summer months in the Northeast, I weigh in on June and I reflect about how your mother-in-law used to just sigh at the thought of what a wonderful month June is.
Remember it well. Jay, what were you on this?
I said in the open, I'm kind of stunned that September is people's favorite summer month because I don't think of it as summer, but it's my favorite month of the year. That and June are my two favorite months of the year. And I hate August. I hate August almost as much as I hate March. They're just two extremes weather-wise. But I was just surprised. I mean, they did ask, which is your favorite? And they did list all four. I'm just surprised that a third of the people chose September.
Barb's theme, maybe it's because kids go back to school.
Because kids go back to school, so it's a great month, yeah. In the Northeast, the best part about September is that the ocean water is actually the warmest in September and the beaches are empty. So if you're out at Cape Cod or you're along the North Carolina shore, or if you're on Long Island or the Jersey shore, the water's the warmest and the beaches are much more empty. And the air temperature is still great. So yeah, September's great.
No, let me bring Hunter in on this.
I will say most of my decisions are usually centered around how I can travel during said months, or can I relate it to travel? I will say June, July, and August are the most expensive and the busiest months for travel. So I don't really like those months at all. You'll never really hear me say that I'm a fan of the summer. It's just overpriced because everybody's going out. Everybody's on vacation. So I guess I'm going to have to say September here because travel is the cheapest. Though I would not call September a summer month. I would probably call May a summer month before I call September one. But that's me and my college student calendar.
Yeah, it definitely affects it. Okay, and Neil, what you got?
I think June is probably my favorite summer month. I like how it's at the beginning, so you have that anticipation. Sometimes the anticipation is better than the actual moment, like Christmas season, how there's the build up to Christmas season, and then Christmas morning is fun. And then sometimes once you get to the afternoon, kind of like, wow, what do I do now? That's kind of how like August feels for me, September feels for me. So I definitely like June because there's things to look forward to.
So I guess now where we are in the calendar, there's going to be a nation of unhappy people because August is right in front of us.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Hunter Petro,
AJ Cambino, Tommy Rogers, and Cassidy Connors.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.